Gloucester History Festival.
Beams and the Blackfriars were donated by Henry III. And
I mean, there's so much great stuff that goes on here. If anyone's not been to Gloucester History Festival...
The Gloucester History Festival special series on History with Jackson. So hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast, and today we welcome author and historian Ian Mortimer onto the podcast, and we're going to discuss a really exciting subject now in Edward II. How you doing, Ian?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much for asking me.
That's all right. Now, I'm really excited to get stuck into talking about Edward, but I think the first question I want to ask you is, what inspires you and drives you to go and research and learn about Edward?
About Edward in particular, I mean, there are two things. My life's dedicated to history and how we know what things we haven't seen with our own eyes, how we can understand our place in the world. So generally, I'm inspired to get out of bed every morning to investigate the mysteries of what it is to be alive and how it is to understand ourselves in time. So that's one thing. But within that, there's a very specific reason I'm interested in Edward II's fate. And that is because despite the fact that lots of academics can rest on their laurels and say, oh, yes, he died in 1327, buried in blah, blah, blah. Actually, the way you get to the truth about Edward II is a whole new philosophy of history. It's an antidote to the postmodernist questioning of history. It's an antidote to the people who say you can't prove the past, though that's a technicality we'll come on to, I'm sure. It's actually a whole revelation of how you can know about things you haven't seen with your own eyes. And for that reason, it's like bloody heroin in the intellectual veins.
That is such a great answer. Oh, I love that. That's absolutely awesome. So, there might be some people listening to this podcast who don't actually know who Edward II was. So I think we need a little bit of guidance about who this king was, what he was like as a person as well.
Okie dokie. He's Edward II is one of our less preferred kings. He was not a bad man. He put in temporal context. He was born in 1284 in April. He was the son of Edward I, an extraordinarily martial and judge legalistic king, and a remarkable man, Edward I. Edward II wasn't like his father. He was a disappointment to his father. He was very pious. He was not militaristic. He inherited the throne at age 23. He had certain insecurities, which meant he relied on his close friends like Piers Gaveston. He was not a bad man. We must get away from the idea that bad kings are bad men. He was not like King John. He was not like George IV. He was not like Richard II. He does not deserve to be called a bad man, but he was very pious, very pacifistic. He alienated his noblemen by preferring people who bolster his self-worth, often of low birth or mere knightly birth rather than earldoms, etc. And so his entire reign was one of tension because he believed in himself as king by divine right, although that concept was a later one, but that's the way he thought. And yet he just rubbed everybody in the aristocracy up the wrong way. So by 1311, he'd only been on the throne for 4 years, and he was sort of held to account by his lords and forced to agree to a set of ordinances. By 1318, the country was practically at civil war. 1322, it was at civil war. Edward ended up fighting his noblemen, some key people being killed, executed, him taking control of the realm, and imprisoning a lot of his most important lords. So he's an extraordinarily divisive character. And in 1323, one of his imprisoned lords, Lord Mortimer, who's no connection to me, by the way, escaped from the Tower of London, fled to France, was in exile in France, and a year later teamed up with Edward II's wife, Queen Isabella, and eventually her son, the heir, the future Edward III, and Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella, Edward III, basically invaded England with a mercenary army in 1326 and brought about the end of Edward II's reign. So he's divisive, but he's also remarkable because he sort of triggers this invasion of England. And England isn't used to being invaded. It happened in 1066, obviously, and it happened in 1217 when the French tried to claim the throne. But he basically brings about this crisis, and crises are very interesting in English history. All sorts of things happen when you have a king who is not in control, because sparks fly and revolutions happen, and our constitution gets big kicking and normally comes out slightly changed.
I think you make a really, really nice point there, that we need to remember that bad kings are not bad people. There's so many English kings that are not deserving of being called bad people, like Henry VI, Edward, for instance. But then when you say he's not a bad person, why is Isabella, his wife, going against him with someone who has escaped from the Tower of London?
I think to understand that, you've got to understand something of psychological pressure on a medieval king. Especially if you've got forces in your own kingdom ranged against you. And how do you deal with this? You rely on some people around you. You rely on your chosen henchmen, for want of a better word. That's a bit of a misleading. You rely on those sort of aristocrats who you think can give you good advice. And in Edward II's case, towards the end of his by 1320, he was relying very heavily on the advice of one Hugh Despenser, who was it's a very difficult character to pin down, Hugh Despenser, but he's manipulative, he's self-interested, he's ruthless, and he wants to control access to the king, and he doesn't care about the king's relationship with the queen. He's going to manipulate Edward II whichever way he thinks is best for him and the king. He does have the king's interests at heart, but the king is very much a vehicle of Despenser's machinations. I think that relationship, Edward II's reliance on Hugh Despenser, was what drove a real wedge between Edward and Isabella. I mean, she said so as much herself when she was in France. And I think that is the secret to understanding the secret. It is the key to understanding the calamities that followed. That Isabella found herself pushed out, alienated, and this Machiavellian, to use another anachronistic term, manipulator there at her husband's side, doing things that she didn't approve of, alienating people who she really didn't want to see alienated. For example, had already sworn that he was going to take a vengeance for his grandfather's death on the grandson of the person who killed him. And the grandfather of Roger Mortimer was the person who killed Despenser's grandfather. So there was a feud already there. There was already a bitterness being brought into the royal family in a way that Queen Isabella didn't approve of. And when she was given the responsibility of trying to negotiate a peace treaty with France and sent to France, she was from France, she took the opportunity to exercise her freedom and her liberty and be critical of her husband and of his jumped up minion, for want of a better word. And that is where the invasion plan comes from. Roger Mortimer is very much the militaristic leader to it, but she's a figurehead. She's not nobody, Queen Isabella.
So after that invasion and this civil war, how do they get hold of Edward? Because it's quite a jump to go from, having Edward as king to then, having this supposed death.
It's quite a jump, God, yeah. I mean, if you wanted to go and visit England any one particular year, I do recommend having a view of 1326 through to 1327. So much was happening. I mean, when they invaded with a mercenary army, which wasn't very big. They risked everything with it's probably about 1,500 men, something like that. Anyway, however many it was, they land. They're very defensive in the way they landed, Isabella and Roger Mortimer, landing in East Anglia above a riverway. I can't remember the name of the river, but in such a way that they were well protected from the moment of landing. And they knew that London was going to declare for them. So they did have an ace in the pack, as it were. London was going to declare in their favour. And the king summoned the largest army which had ever been summoned at that point. He summoned something like 42,000 men to come and defend the country, and virtually no one turned up. And he fled because London was going to be against him. The army hadn't turned up. He was advised, run to Wales, which is what he did. And he was captured by the Earl of Lancaster, and having failed to escape by boat from South Wales. And he was imprisoned in Kenilworth Castle. And then Roger Mortimer, Lancaster, Adam Allerton, Bishop of Hereford, various other key characters basically sat down and thought, oh God, what are we going to do next? And they came up with this remarkable idea that they were going to depose Edward II. Now, it seems obvious to us, but if you're there in 1326, 1327, December 1326, Christmas time, what do you want for Christmas? Edward II's head on the platter might have been one of the things, but they don't do that. They didn't do that. Now, who had been deposed beforehand? If you think across, well, certain popes had been deposed, but popes were elected. So that's, human beings elect popes, and human beings can get rid of popes. That's logical. Holy Roman emperors had been deposed, but Holy Roman emperors were selected by the electors. They were, again, people chosen and could be put down again. Only one anointed king, as far as I know, Sancho of Portugal, had ever been deposed, and he was deposed by order of the Pope. So the idea that Roger Mortimer swans in and thinks, we're going to use Parliament to depose a monarch, even though Parliament really is a body to advise the monarch, it's absolutely revolutionary. And it's one of the most important things of the last 1,000 years, the idea that representatives of the people can get rid of the monarch, the divinely appointed head of state. And this is Roger Mortimer's idea. He basically is the puppet master for the whole Parliament that gets rid of Edward II. And on the 25th of January, Edward III becomes king because Roger Mortimer put it to Edward II, either you abdicate in favour of your son or we depose you. And he had Parliament behind him to say, yes, that's what will happen. The Archbishop of Canterbury said in Parliament, it is the will of the people is the will of God. And if the will of God is that Edward II should go, that's the end of his reign. So that was the situation Edward II was put in. He did abdicate in favour of Edward III. And so Edward III became king, as I say, on 25th of January 1327, at the age of 14. So the government in 1327 was in the hands of Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella, supposedly also in the hands of the Royal Council overseeing the king, but Roger Mortimer had very clever ways of going straight over their heads. There's no doubt that England in 1327 was a dictatorship in which Queen Isabella and the king, Edward III, were titular or nominal figures, and real power lay with Roger Mortimer.
It's a really interesting method of doing it. As you said, revolutionary, but it does kind of set a blueprint for what happens a few generations below with Richard and Henry. But then what happens to Edward here? Because this is such a huge step to abdicate in favour of your son. Is there kind of an idea of what they do with him? Because, he can't go off to another country, really, because he's a prisoner.
Yeah.
It could be a tool.
This is the bit they hadn't thought through. What do you do with somebody who has anointed a king? No, you can't unanoint somebody. Once you've had the divine oil on your head and you have been blessed and all that, you are anointed king. So it's a problem they really hadn't thought through. And the events of 1327, well, could you ever have thought them through? I think we ought to cut them a little bit of slack here. And how on earth do you imagine, if you're in uncharted waters, you don't know which way to go by definition. They unlike getting rid of any previous king, they didn't kill Edward II. They kept him in Berkeley Castle. He was transferred to Berkeley Castle in April 1327 and put under the custody of Sir John Maltravers and Lord Berkeley. Lord Berkeley being Roger Mortimer's son-in-law. And basically they thought that would be it. He'd be imprisoned for life. And as things turned out, of course, Edward II, he wasn't a bad man. As I said, he had lots of loyalists. And some of his loyalists were very powerful people. And in we're jumping ahead if I go and say what happens next, but the clergy were especially fond of Edward II because he was a pious man, and therefore there were certain friars who wanted him released and restored to the throne. And in June 1327, they succeeded in springing him from Berkeley Castle. They managed to get him as far as Bristol before the government managed to get things together, found him, arrested him, and dragged him back to Berkeley Castle. So he was back at Berkeley Castle by August 1327. And then on the 14th of September 1327, when Lord Mortimer was at Abergavenny, he received a letter from his agent in North Wales, William Shalford, saying that there's another plot to release Edward II. And it's imminent. And Roger Mortimer handed the letter he'd received from William Shalford to one of his retainers called William Ockley. And he said, take this to Berkeley Castle and tell Lord Berkeley to effect a suitable remedy. And those are the words used by a witness, to effect a suitable remedy. So off William Ockley trots to Berkeley Castle. He probably got there in a day or two. And Lord Berkeley hesitates, but a week later he sent a message through to the king and the Queen Mother at Lincoln, saying Edward II died on the 21st of September 1327 of an illness. This is Lord Berkeley's suitable remedy. He is going to fake the king's death so no one tries to rescue him again.
So there's an interesting word within that answer there. You say he fakes his death as a suitable remedy. That seems to be at odds with the traditional narratives that we have surrounding Edward's death.
Yeah, it's completely at odds. And this is why the whole question is so interesting. How can you be certain what happened in 1327 by comparison with centuries of tradition and academic consensus even today that says he died in 1327, in Berkeley Castle in 1327? It's a subject I've devoted, more than 25 years to now. In fact, I can remember very clearly the moment I realised where I was going to go with this. It was on the 7th of December 2001. I was sitting in my study at my old house here in Morton Hampstead, writing my book, The Greatest Traitor, about Roger Mortimer. And about 11 o'clock in the morning, I realised, oh my God, this only points in one direction, and I'm going to have to confront everybody. And how right I was. Yeah, you have to approach this from a point of view which is not traditional. The way we normally look, all historians normally look at the past, is by way of evidence. The way anybody looks at anything they haven't seen with their own eyes is to take evidence and analyse evidence and see what it says. And actually, this isn't the right way to go about things. Postmodernism should have shown people there are better ways, but we don't learn from postmodernism. We just think, it's one of those things that happens to other people. It's a thing for philosophers, maybe interested in the creative world, but doesn't apply to history. And because historians hate historical methodology and they hate philosophy, they haven't really learnt these lessons. If you can define something about the past, doesn't matter what it is. Well, actually, it does matter what it is. If you can define it in absolute terms, if you can have something like Edward II was alive at a certain point, or was dead at a certain point, if you can define it, a piece of information, in that absolute way, you can look for the information that's within the evidence and see if that can be verified for or against that question. In other words, you have to reduce everything to information science. Now, historians don't like information science because they don't like anything to do with science if they can possibly help it. They like to have a piece of evidence and say, I trust that piece of evidence. But evidence is nothing other than a container in which information has come down to us. You may have 1,000 pieces of evidence and a single source. And so, do you can trust those 1,000 pieces of evidence? Historically, historians do that. They think there's an overwhelming weight of evidence that he died in Berkeley Castle. Look at all these chronicles. Look at the royal accounts. Look at the funeral arrangements in the royal accounts. There's overwhelming evidence Edward II died in Berkeley Castle, and that is absolutely true. And all that evidence relies on one single piece of information that Edward II, via Thomas Gurney to Lincoln, to Edward III, the Queen Mother, on the 21st of September 1327, saying Edward II died of an illness. It was received at Lincoln on the night of the 23rd. We know that for certain. There's a letter from Edward III that says so. And it was announced to the people attending Parliament, who had just attended Parliament, the following day, 24th. Now, it's 148 miles from Berkeley to Lincoln. There's no way that could possibly be checked. So the information was taken at face value. The royal household was informed because Lord Berkeley had said so. Everything comes down to one message from Lord Berkeley. When you employ information science, you realise that the whole idea that Edward II died in 1327 is down to one message sent by Lord Berkeley on that day, saying the king had died of illness. And this was Lord Berkeley's strategy to stop people trying to rescue him. That one message, was it true or false? 3 years later, Lord Berkeley said, I haven't heard that Edward II is dead yet. His actual words were in Latin, would have expressed in French, but recorded in Latin. He had not heard about the king's death and of the king's death until that present parliament. So that was in 1330. If he didn't know about the death in 1330, he didn't know about it in 1327. So that one message on which everything relies was false. It was disinformation. It had a purpose, but it was still disinformation. The purpose was to stop Edward II being rescued.
So, what's your view of what's happened to Edward at that point? Because if Berkeley doesn't know what's happened, or doesn't know that he's died, where's he gone?
Lord Berkeley had Edward II removed from Berkeley Castle and taken to Corfe Castle. I don't have any doubt about that, and there are multiple pieces of evidence that say that is the case. One's the Fieschi letter, the other one's the confession of the Earl of Kent, the letter of the Earl of Kent to try and rescue his half-brother. The Earl of Kent was a very brave man, Edward II's half-brother, who tried to rescue him after his death had been faked. He discovered he was at Corfe Castle and was executed for trying to make Edward II king again. So there's a whole fiasco that follows Lord Berkeley's strategy. It could have worked if no one had ever found out about Edward II not being dead. But you can't really control a medieval household that tightly. Even though Edward II was probably kept in a windowless and doorless chamber at Corfe Castle after his supposed death, the news was going to get out somewhere along the line. Someone feeding him was going to blag to somebody else. And yeah, the news did get out. Lord Berkeley deliberately misinformed the king and the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother probably had an idea and certainly would have been told very quickly that her husband wasn't dead. She was very close to her husband, even though he'd done a fair bit to alienate her. She kept on giving him presents in prison, for example. So she wouldn't have sanctioned his being murdered or anything like that. But the situation got out of hand, and therefore Edward's half-brother, the Earl of Kent, who tried to rescue him, eventually he had to be made the subject of a show trial and executed for nothing other than trying to rescue his wrongly imprisoned, ex-king of a brother. So that was terrible, but Edward II remained a problem and a thorn in the government's side until Roger Mortimer fell from power on the 19th of October, 1330. And then Edward II was let go. And that created an even bigger problem for the government because Edward III didn't know where he was.
It feels very Stalinist, all this disinformation and the movement of people. So why doesn't Edward III know where he is? Obviously, they have to kind of hold Edward III to power now, but why doesn't he know where his dad is?
Well, he's still very, very young, remember. He's 14 in 1327. He turned 15 after the supposed death. He didn't know his father was alive because the woman who embalmed, when you embalm a royal corpse or an aristocratic corpse in the Middle Ages, the body is covered with cerecloth, which is wax impregnated cloth, and it covers the face as well. You can't see anything. You wouldn't recognize anyone. You could put anybody into a tomb, and this was what happened. So the woman who covered Edward II was taken on the Queen's orders to we presume to meet the king at Gloucester in December 1327. It was definitely on the Queen's orders that the woman who did the embalming was taken to the royal household. So Edward III was probably told then by the woman who'd embalmed his supposed father, that it wasn't actually his father, and his father was still being kept alive. You can understand why they had to tell Edward III that his father was not dead, but you can also understand why they didn't tell him where he was. And after the Earl of Kent had tried to rescue Edward II from Corfe Castle, Edward II was smuggled to Ireland, which is where Roger Mortimer had enormous power. He was the dominant lord in Ireland. And there he was kept until Roger Mortimer's fall. So probably no one in England knew where, apart from Roger Mortimer, knew where Edward II was 1330. So when Roger Mortimer fell, he was given a show trial, but he was gagged. He wasn't allowed to speak at his show trial. And then he was hanged. No one knew where Edward II was. And Edward II was released by his jailer. According to a later document, the Fieschi letter, he took a boat to Sandwich, but didn't disembark in England. He went straight across to France and then made a pilgrimage to Avignon, where he went to meet the Pope and his kinsman, the Fieschi family, who looked after him for the rest of his life.
It's such an interesting story. And it's far more interesting what the traditional narrative of what happens.
I think so too, yeah.
But why why wasn't there a move to put Edward back on the throne after the Mortimer dies? And, did they just want to leave Edward III there?
Oh, well, Edward II obviously proved himself remarkably divisive. He was the last person you wanted to put back on the throne, to be honest. And we don't know, but if you could have asked him, he probably wouldn't have wanted it, because it had been nothing but trouble to him. Edward III also did not want to relinquish power. By the time Mortimer fell, this is, as I say, 19th of October 1330, he was smuggled out of Nottingham Castle through the famous Mortimer's Hole, goes down through the rock, simply so he couldn't get a message to really, to use Edward II to control the young king. That was why the Mortimer's Hole thing is so important. You had to get hold of Mortimer and arrest him and shut him up before he could use the fact he was in charge of Edward II against the current king, the young king, who was then 18. The third was very precarious on his throne, because if it turned out that he had taken the throne while his father, an anointed monarch, was still alive, what right did he have to the throne? Now, Edward III was a unifier of men, and he was reasonably conciliatory. He knew when to bend and when to stand firm. He was a very politically astute person. And although he probably wasn't quite at that maturity at age 18, he knew the stability of the realm was going to depend on there being a stable monarch, not somebody who'd ruled like his father. So he knew, I'm pretty sure, right away that he could not allow his father to come back. Because also, what would his father have done to him? Because he had defied his father by staying in France with his mother in the years before the invasion, and Edward II had sent some pretty nasty letters to his son, threatening him all sorts of dire punishments if he didn't come home, and Edward III had disobeyed him. So there are lots of questions up in the air there. So the fact that Edward III doesn't know where his father was, who was looking after him, who had power over him, he didn't have really any choice but to say, I'm king. Everybody says my father's dead. Okay, my father's dead. I'm going to say that Roger Mortimer murdered him, and then we can just move on. I'll find out what happened to my father some other time, and we'll deal with that another day. I'm going to make sure I'm securing the throne for myself. And that's the way he was thinking in 1330. It transpired very quickly that Edward II had gone to the papal court and was out of Edward III's control. He was in the control of the Fieschi. The Fieschi are a Genoese family, very powerful, internationally powerful. There were so many connections in so many countries. They're like an ecclesiastical mafia throughout the whole of Europe, headed by Cardinal Luca Fieschi, who was Edward II's kinsman. He was his second or third cousin. I can't work out exactly which. But he's always referred to as the kinsman. So Edward III's lost control of the man, and they're in the hands of the Genoese, who, of course, have relationships with the French, and we're just about to go to war with France. Things are very tense. But why did he not put his father back on the throne? Too much doubt, too much fear, too great a risk that Edward II would bugger everything up again.
And it's very, as you say, very politically astute from Edward III. But then there's a question there about, why are the Genoese, the papacy, and the French not using Edward II as a tool themselves if they have power over him?
This is the most interesting bit, is how they used him. They did. Okay, Edward III had heard that Edward II was in the Fieschi custody or Fieschi power or papal power. He might have just learned about the Pope by the end of March 1330. He authorised two men to go and negotiate with the Pope. He authorised his old tutor, Richard de Bury, Bishop of Durham, and he also authorised Cardinal Luca Fieschi's nephew, well, married to his niece, a man called Antonio Pisano. And off these two go with authorisation to borrow up to £50,000 on the king's business. The king's secret businesses overseas, as it's always called. And they get to the papal court, and the Pope says, that's not enough. Now, £50,000 is more than the English royal income for the year. It is about 1.5 times English royal income for the year, and the Pope clearly said it was not enough. So they come back. Edward III is a bit taken aback. 1332, he sends them back again to negotiate again. Again, they come back without any results. Antonio Pisano then very unfortunately goes and dies, which leaves Edward to send Richard de Bury again, and this time he sends another agent of his, John de Shoreditch. And they go back to Avignon, and this time they are laden with presents. They have presents for all the cardinals. They give pensions to all the cardinals. They have chalices and lavish treasures to heap on all the staff of the papal court. And this time they are authorised to borrow up to £200,000. 6 times the English royal income, roughly. And the Pope sends back a letter saying, I'll respond by word of mouth, trust this man with the message I send. Nothing goes in writing. It's always the king's secret business overseas, and the messages are always trust what the message that this person brings you. They don't write what the message is in the secret correspondence. Anyway, £200,000 is authorised, and then between then and 1341, Edward III pays more than £186,000 to Italian bankers, the Bardi and the Peruzzi family, banking families, and he also gives them 2 of the crowns of England. He basically mortgages England because they've got his father and they could release him if they wanted to. They could undermine his entire reign. And the longer this goes on, of course, the more embarrassing it would be for Edward II. And we're not Edward III, sorry. And we're not just talking about embarrassment. We would be looking at undermining of his regnal authority. So it's important he has the Italians and the French Pope control Edward II, but considering they're his enemy, he has to pay an enormously high price for it.
So from that point and having to pay that price to make sure that his authority is secure, does he build a relationship there with his father? Because there still is a lot of bridges to mend on that front.
There are, yeah, good question. In 1336, the last day of January 1336, Cardinal Luca Fieschi died. And this, a cardinal died doesn't really sound like a big thing to us, but really across Europe is like a monarch dying, because all the people who are dependent on him, all the nephews, have lost that linchpin. It's a huge thing. So Cardinal Luca Fieschi's death means, what are we going to do about Edward II? Now, Edward II, by this stage, was being looked after by Cardinal Luca Fieschi's nephew, Niccolo Malaspina, Il Marchesotto. He's an Italian warlord who's based at Oromala in northern Italy. And Edward II is being held at a sanctuary just down the road from Oromala. And Luca Fieschi's notary and secretary and kinsman, Manuela Fieschi, writes to Edward II saying, this is what has happened to your father, and this is where he is. And this letter is probably brought to Edward III in April 1336 by another member of the Fieschi family, a relation of Manuela's, called Nicolinus Fieschi, who gives him this letter. Edward III meets Nicolinus Fieschi on a boat in the Thames. This is where you have secret negotiations in the middle of the river when no one can hear what's going on. And Nicolinus Fieschi is immediately made member of the King's Council, given robes of state, robes of honour, befitting his position as a royal councillor. He's given a large income, roughly £220 a year, which is a lot of money at the time, for advising Edward. And Edward III employs him as his lawyer, basically, his European lawyer. Nicolinus is a lawyer in the first place, normally representing Genoa, but he becomes Edward III's lawyer, dealing with the second situation. And number of people of Fieschi, Antonio Fieschi, who's another nephew, comes over and negotiates with Edward III in the course of 1336, 1337. But in 1336, at the same time as Edward III meets Nicolinus in the river, he arranges for a man to hire 2 Genoese galleys. He doesn't say what the purpose is in that hiring of these 2 galleys, but they are transpires in the end to bring Edward II to meet Edward III. And it's beset with disasters all the way through this whole plot. It takes 2.5 years for the 2 men actually to meet. James of Aragon finds out what's going on and sequesters all the money that Edward III has sent to meet Edward, so he can meet. And there are piles of disasters. But eventually, in October 1338, Edward III gets to meet his father again at Koblenz in Germany. He'd arranged for him to be brought by boat by Niccolo Bianco di Fieschi, yet another Fieschi member, to Cologne, and the Fieschi had left him at Cologne and then sent him by land to Koblenz, where the 2 men actually finally met. And after that meeting, Edward III invited his father, going under the name William le Gallais, William the Welshman, to come and spend Christmas with them in the following December at Antwerp, because Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second surviving son, had just been born. And so therefore Edward II did get to meet one of his grandchildren.
It's so at odds with this traditional narrative, but it is such a nice story that the fact that Edward gets to meet his father again. But does that meeting have any wider implications across Europe and across England?
Across England, no, none at all. The biggest consequence I can see is that Edward II had clearly said to Edward III he really regretted the way he treated his own father in death. Because after that meeting, Edward III every year has the tomb of Edward I surrounded by candles. No one did it beforehand. It's from that meeting onwards that Edward I's tomb is properly celebrated. And I cannot help but feel that since Edward II had not looked after his father in death very well, that there was a sense of regret there, and that was imparted. And I do think that there would have been questions from Edward III to his father about his relationship with his father, because Edward III looked up to his grandfather, Edward I, with admiration and awe, and his father, Edward II, was the missing link between the two. So I can't help but feel that that is an important personal element from that meeting. Were there any other implications in England? No. The people who knew that Edward II was still alive in England, people like the Archbishop of York, William Milton, it didn't change anything from their point of view. They still kept up. I mean, Archbishop Milton had one of his clergymen resident at the Fieschi household, keeping in touch with Edward II, so he knew what was going on. Did it matter politically? No. The people who didn't know weren't bothered. As far as they're concerned, Edward II was still dead. The people who did know didn't change anything for them. From Edward III's point of view, he had security in that he knew really who was looking after his father, and he probably had reassurance that they would look after him until his father was dead. So I think there was probably a degree of personal relief, but I can't see that there was any political change as a result of that meeting. And in fact, the political situation was resolved in many ways by the Fieschi doing what they were being paid to do, or what the Pope was receiving money for, in quietly looking after Edward II. Incidentally, the Pope decided to spend all the money on rebuilding the Papal Palace at Avignon. When you look at the Papal Palace in Avignon, you think, my God, the popes really were quite extravagant. That was all built with English money, I want you to know. It was the ransom for Edward II.
I mean, Avignon is stunning. So at least, Edward III and Edward II have given that.
Yeah, European contribution. But of course, most people would say, oh, no, he died in Berkeley Castle, therefore nothing to do with it. No, the money for building Avignon Palace was started in 1335. It was a result of the promises that year of up to £200,000. The way Edward III made that money available was he gave Richard de Bury and John Shoreditch letters of authority to borrow up to £50,000, then another letter up to another £50,000, and then a letter for £30,000, and a letter authorising up to £20,000. So clearly there was a bargaining thing, and they ended up having to use all the letters. The Pope was a very canny man.
Yeah, as many popes have been across. Yeah,
they're very good when it comes to money, aren't they?
So what happens, towards the end of Edward II's life? When does he die, and how does he spend the rest of his life?
Trying to prove when he died is impossible. You can show lots of circumstantial evidence for the theory that he died at the end of 1341. Proving it, of course, is impossible because you don't have the information. I mean, you take my original point about how do we know he didn't die, it's a matter of sorting out information flows and showing that the original information flow for the death is unsustainable, and there are multiple information flows from people who knew him and saw him at a later date, or who knew he was alive at a later date, which are corroborated by people who really were in the know. It's all a matter of information science. You can't do that for survival, because you can't actually show he was alive after 1340. What you need to do is work with circumstantial evidence, because that is all there is. So you work with the basis that Edward III carried on paying money for his father's safe custody abroad well into 1340. And then in 1341, in the depths of winter, Edward III organises this massive big tournament. He liked tournaments, Edward III. But this one had a purpose. because all the way around the grounds where this tournament was being held were big banners with, in English, the motto, "It is as it is." At last, things are as well as they're meant to be. That's a really signal moment. 200 odd knights were invited to take part, and it was absolute fiasco because you can't really have a big tournament in the depths of winter. There's not enough daylight. Ground gets all churned up. It's a mess. But that's the way Edward III sort of announced things to those who were in the know. It is as it is. 1342, Queen Isabella makes her a foundation near Coventry at Bablake for a chantry for her son, the soul of her husband. She knows he's dead by that stage because that's when she makes the commemoration. There's another, William Melton, Archbishop of Canterbury, who definitely knows Edward II is still alive. He's been in correspondence with the Fieschi all the way through. That's when he rewrites the ordinances of Sibthorpe Chantry to make it clear Edward II is now dead. Previously, the ordinance were written that Edward II was amongst the living. 3 is when the title, the Prince of Wales, is finally given to the Black Prince. He hadn't been able to give it to him. Edward III had not been able to give his eldest son the title Prince of Wales until then because Edward II had never given it up. So he called himself William of Wales. There was a reminder that he still had the title Prince of Wales. 1342 is an interesting date because in December 1342, Edward III authorised a chap called Francisco Forzetti, his name is in Italian, who'd been involved with the Edward II thing all the way through. Edward III ordered Francisco Forzetti to go to Haverfordwest in Wales and arrest a ship and all its contents and take it intact to Bristol. And I'm pretty sure that boat was carrying a large Italian lead coffin in which Edward II, and from Bristol it had been very easy to take it up to Gloucester, where Edward III had arranged for the rebuilding of Gloucester Abbey, now cathedral, so that when Edward II died, it could be put into his grave pretty surreptitiously. Edward II is there to this day. I mean, he's the one time that he was opened that grave, they looked at the coffin, and the coffin is the shape of an Italian coffin. So I'm pretty sure that boat, which Francisco Forzetti took to Gloucester in 1342, probably got there by January 1343, contained Edward II. So my theory, and it can only be a theory, I have to admit, for the actual death side of things, is that he died in 1341, was embalmed in Italy and brought back to England in December 1342, and probably put into his grave in early 1343. The commemorations all tally with this as well. And 1343 is when Edward III makes a great big visit to Gloucester and goes to the tomb and places expensive things on the altar to commemorate his father.
And that leads me to a really nice question I find interesting now. Is you mentioned that in the possible conversation between Edward II and Edward III, he said he regretted the way that he treated his father in death. How does Edward III treat his father in death after that point?
After 1343, with greatest respect, there are commemorations. I mean, he always officially celebrated his death on the 21st of September, or 22nd. Actually, he got it on the 22nd of September. Frequently, he got the day wrong. So there's always this sort of notional official date for a number of years. But after 1343, Gloucester's really important to him, and it isn't before. He'd only been once to Gloucester in the period between 1327 and 1343. He went once in 1337, and that was probably to arrange with the abbot how you're going to get Edward II into his tomb when the time comes, and okay, we'll rebuild the whole east end of Gloucester Cathedral or Gloucester Abbey to make it possible. So that one visit in 1337 is probably to arrange things. 1343. There is due respect to his father after that date.
I think that's a really nice way for Edward III to make sure that his father's paid the proper respect. But I think now's the right time to ask you a final fun question, Ian, as do for all guests on the podcast. You mentioned that you like visiting old pubs.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, have you got a favourite old pub?
A favourite. As you probably guessed, I'm doing a big book about all the old pubs in the country. So we are visiting, my wife and I are visiting every single pub in the country that either is or claims to date before 1500. So everywhere. And we're looking at some of the ones that don't claim it and which possibly do. So it's a survey of all the old pubs and the stories that people tell about them. And I'm interested in the false stories as well, the complete lies that people tell. When it comes to favourite pubs, I'm very lucky in having up the road from me the Drew Arms in Stainton, which is not an old pub. I know its history back to about 1750. The current building is probably about 50 years older than that. It espouses every single virtue of an old pub there could possibly be. You walk in there and there's no music. There is just plain walls, plain old furniture. There isn't a bar. It still has a tap room. It's proper in every sense of the way. And in Devon, where I live, the word proper means something. It's really proper. And the Drew Arms is therefore where I'm planning to go and write the end of the book. I've come across so many pubs that say, oh, such and such was built, book was written here. It's always Count of the Baskervilles as well by Conan Doyle for some reason. There's loads of pubs that claim Count of the Baskervilles. Anyway, because they're all bollocks, because frankly, writers go to pubs to drink, not to write books, I'm going to go to the Drew Arms and finish my book on old pubs in the Drew Arms. So you could say that's my favourite. I have a scoring system for the oldest pubs, and it's a quality-driven one as well as an antiquity-driven one. And it also takes into consideration the amount of bullshit you get along the line. And there are 2 pubs so far out of the 1,010 I think I've looked at, which have scored 20 out of 20. The George in Norton St Philip in Somerset, and the Crown in Shipton under Wychwood, which I think is on the Oxfordshire side of the border with Worcestershire. Anyway, it's up on the border there. Those 2 scored 20 out of 20. And I say we've looked at over 1,000 now. And I've enjoyed all but about 6 or 7 of them.
That's really good going. That's really good going.
Well, dedication to the subject, As I say, my life's dedicated about the past and our understanding the past and understanding how people have enjoyed living in the past and what pubs mean to English culture. It's a big part of my life.
I really, really like that answer. No, thank you very much, Ian.
You're welcome.
Now, if people want to grab copies of your books, where can they go?
Well, you'll find my Time Travellers books everywhere. Most bookshops will have copies of Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, etc. Fewer and fewer bookshops now have the medieval biographies with which I started my career. They are The Greatest Traitor, Life of Roger Mortimer, The Perfect King, Life of Edward III. There's a book on Henry IV, another one on Henry V. There's a much more in-depth book called Medieval Intrigue, which starts off what I've been talking about here, how you can be sure about Edward II didn't die. And that includes a reproduction of an academic article I wrote in English Historical Review, published by Oxford University Press in 2005. So if you're really interested in the Edward II story, I would suggest reading The Perfect King, my biography of Edward III, which will easily be available online, and bigger bookshops will have a copy. And probably ordering a copy of Medieval Intrigue, the more in-depth book. There is another book along the lines on the way, but it's not going to be out for another 2 years.
All right. Oh, I'm looking forward to that coming out, and then I'll make sure they're all in the description below as well. But then if people want to keep up to date with you, where can they go?
I have a website. I'm very bad at social media. Frankly, I don't have time for social media because I'm constantly... I eat, drink, and I walk, and I run, and I write history, and there's very little else going on otherwise. So social media, I'm very bad at. But if you want to get in touch with me, that's probably the best way, or through my agent. But my website is where you'll get most information about me. I haven't updated my What's New page this year. We're now in April, so that's looking more and more like a failure. But I've just been working really, really hard. I've been working on the Edward II thing, and I'm just looking forward to this talk in Gloucester weekend after next. And I've been working on a book about the principles of history, how you can use information science in conjunction with history to reappraise what we know of the past. And I'm just coming to the end of a book which looks at the whole of English history from the point of view of the people who've been living in my house for the last 1,000 years, because this site is unbelievably old. The house itself dates from the 13th century, part of it does, but it's arranged around the lines of Bronze Age reeves. So it's been a settled site since the Saxons arrived here and found the reeve system in place. So since the 8th century. So there's that book that's I've got a gun in my head from the publishers about that one at the moment. It's got to be done by the end of the month. So I just haven't had time to do things like social media and what's new on my website. But if you want to get more information about me, look at ianmortimer.com.
I'll make sure there's a link for your website in the description below. But yeah, I can imagine you've got many guns from many publishers against your head at the moment.
Well, that one's a big one.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Ian. I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me. Thank you.
At Gloucester History Festival.
Beams and the Blackfriars were donated by Henry III. And
I mean, there's so much great stuff that goes on here. If anyone's not been to Gloucester History Festival,
The Gloucester History Festival special series on history with Jackson.